Good morning and welcome to our final e-learning series session. Stop that. I'm stopping. Sorry, guys. Good morning and welcome to our final session in the Service-Oriented IT e-learning series. Today we're going to be talking about human resources. As usual, our format for the session today is a panelist discussion on the key considerations related to human resources. And just very simply, there's a lot going on in IT. Behind everything that does happen in IT, there are people involved, and we need to understand the roles and much more that we'll talk about in this session today. So let's do some brief introductions. Pierre.
Sure. My name is Pierre Paquette. I'm the CTO here at Rappa Technologies, or Rappa Consulting. 25 years of working in technology and on the technology side, always thinking about the solutions and how they can be applied and get value out of it. And often how that relates up to the business is really where my passion is how can you get value from that technology. So working in spaces in ITAM and ITSM in the last 15, 20 years, in other technologies before that. So yeah, that kind of rounds things up.
Hi everyone, my name is Susan Odell and I'm CEO at Rappa. My role is really to focus on our business objectives and our business operations. My background, 21 years on the business side of IT, primarily in enterprise software and enterprise services, helping large organizations focus on the things that they need to improve and then applying technical solutions to those problems. Background, very diverse, IT service management, asset management, systems management, document management, and learning management systems. So, a broad-based background in technology as well as business strategy and operational performance. Richard.
My name is Richard Larocque. I'm the IT Management Knowledge Director at Rappa. Bragging on a number of years, I got over 25 years of business system consulting. So my role is really within kind of the process area, the business practice, how do you manage, how to manage IT. So really bringing, some of the knowledge of Suze from a business perspective, Pierre from a technology perspective, and I try to be like the glue in the middle from a process perspective to make sure one delivers to the other. So lots of background in, IT service management, ITIL-based. As you can see, ITIL V3 expert. I've been doing ITIL-related projects for the last 15 years or so. So I've seen a lot of organizations and I've seen a lot of ways of trying to do these things.
Okay, great. So as I mentioned on the first title slide, this is the last session in the e-learning series for service-oriented IT. We definitely encourage you to go back to our website, resources/videos. You'll see all 10 sessions that take you progressively from the business value of service-oriented IT to breaking down all of the underlying elements within IT that support the business value of IT. Again, today focusing on human resources. So let's start there. This picture is busy, and that's because IT is busy, and not just IT, but the things that IT touches outside of the IT operation. You've got corporate finance that interacts with IT, human resources that interacts with IT, contract management, and there's typically a role for that within IT, and also the broader contract management function within the business. Service management, infrastructure, financial management, asset management, facilities. That's just on the clear lines of business side of things. And then you're looking at how that funnels up through IT leadership to let the executives of an organization understand what's going on. There's just a lot going on. And as Richard coined the title here, that people determine the quality of service to the business. It's anyway, I'll stop talking.
Yeah. So the title, sorry, Pierre, but the title, well, the center bubble may be misleading in a sense. I mean, we're not focusing strictly on an HR from a traditional human resource perspective, but we're really talking about the people side of IT and all, in all of its glory, if you will. There's a lot of people involved in making this IT work, and you have to have, as it says below there, you have to have the right people in the right roles to do that, and that's just as essential as having the right tools and the right processes. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, no, we haven't gone through one of these sessions without talking about IT as a service and trying to reach that. And we're talking about human resource or people that are in place to provide that service. Traditionally, IT has been about technology, and it's sometimes hard. It's hard for me from a technology point of view is to look at people as people and not as just data that gets brought into a system. But I think that's part of the point here, is that the human resource part of it is a huge part of IT providing service out. I mean, budgets within IT will grow for technology, but they also grow in terms of resources and roles, and having the right roles and people in place is key to having IT function in a way of delivering service.
And which brings my my process hat into play too. The way that you make sure that the people contribute in the right way is to have the right processes in place, so that things are done in an orderly fashion. And as it says at the bottom, getting away from the cowboy cowgirl IT approach of to each his own, and we do the best in our universe, and we don't care about the other people's universes. Trying to bring all of these things together, because again, the technologies will work together, but if the people don't work together, you still have a problem. I mean, and that's fundamental. And it's hard, as you said, Pierre. It's hard for IT to really think that way, because we're not about managing people in a lot of the things we do. We're about managing technologies, and we believe that if the technology works, we're fine. But the people aspect is huge.
Yeah, just as a follow-on note to your point there about process, Richard, when you were talking about cowboy and cowgirl attitudes and only looking after yourself, it's also I always think about sustainability, right? So if you're doing something point in time when you're not thinking about how you're going to sustain it ongoing, and what's going to happen after the project is done and whatever particular thing you're trying to solve, then eventually things slow down and then they falter and then they fail. So that whole idea of process is a way that you can sustain the improvements that you're trying to make, or things that you're trying to do. And again, that's not within a silo; it's across teams typically.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Okay. So mapping and measuring HR impact on IT. I mean, this one is huge, right? And it's difficult to do when you're thinking about all the moving pieces and how you're relating that to the activities within IT. Maybe sorry, Pierre, could you kick this one off?
Yeah, we look at HR, and it touches so many areas, and from the bullets that we have here on the left, it really touches from the effectiveness of the workforce, the overlapping roles, and having contingency plans, which traditionally are HR's role, and that's what that's their input to the organization to make sure that those areas are covered. When it comes down to the impact on IT, there's the lower four bullets really touch on them as well. Is the roles and the level of experience is important. It's not just about putting people in place, but it's about putting the right people to get the job done. And sometimes HR doesn't have that insight or doesn't have that view of really the impact that it does have on IT. So there's that line between typical traditional HR roles, and then how HR does truly impact the organization from the IT point of view. And the remaining bullets here in terms of the resource by cost center and department, and the status of an employee and the cost of the actual resource, that's where defining the service that's provided, it helps define the service that's provided. We understand with that information and that how the resource contributes to providing. So when CIOs and IT departments want to deliver IT as a service. Behind that message is we want to know what that service is costing us so that we can now show value from a service point of view as opposed to a technology point of view. So those are the key elements that sometimes we're a little hesitant to start saying, okay, how much is that resource costing and what is that resource working on? It's not to look at how that resource is performing. It's not a judgmental approach. It's more about understanding how it fits into the big picture. And it's that soft HR side of things and that rough technology side of things and how we can make them come together without being too direct.
Yeah. So if I elevate this up to a business question, so what? Who cares, right? If I'm a CEO and I'm looking at my business operations and I'm trying to figure out where I can be more efficient, maybe where I can outsource to reduce my internal costs. It's really important that I understand what people are doing, what the things that they're doing, what are they actually tied to in terms of my operations. Can I make those links? And then how much does that cost? I mean, that's your basis for understanding what my internal cost is so that I can compare that to what an external cost might be. So, you were just saying, Pierre, about the soft side of HR and the hard side of IT. But if you don't have that understanding, then it becomes very difficult to do the proper analysis to say, even if you're not outsourcing, how can you make things more efficient? Where do you have duplication?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that's exactly right. And I don't want to steal the thunder of a further following slide, but we have to realize, and IT has to realize that 50% roughly of its cost is HR, and we spend a lot of time managing things that are a lot less costly from an IT perspective than HR. And so we have to understand that we need a better way of managing HR within IT than what a corporate HR can provide us realistically. Because corporate HR has to manage HR across the entire organization. They can't be specific to each department's needs. They can, they'll do whatever that department asks them to do in a lot of ways, but they won't be able to track the information to the level of detail, as Pierre was mentioning, that we need. So, there has to be an HR for IT, and we have to manage HR much better, whether we're talking about tracking time, whether we're talking about evaluating the performance of resources, as you said, Pierre, not necessarily to say you're doing a good or a bad job, but to understand whether we have the right resources in the right roles. So all of that has to come together within IT because we can't rely just on corporate HR to do it for us.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so getting to your thunder slide, Richard.
Yeah, so basically, I mean, when we were doing on a previous project trying to determine the cost of services, in a way, I think everyone knew that HR was the greatest cost, but they didn't really see it as how it actually fits within the cost of a service. And in this representation here, we see like there's some cost items. So things are happening, people are doing work, and it contributes. It's part of the HR cost of that service. And when you start saying HR is the biggest cost, it's actually a bigger cost than all the hardware and software you buy. It's bigger cost than all the external service you obtain. So it's really important, but we tend to kind of not focus on it. Maybe it's because it's harder to understand. Yeah. But if we're to be able to affect the cost of our services, be able to manage the cost of our services, we need to manage the cost items within it, and the biggest one is certainly HR.
So just as a real example, let's say we've got an IT cost, which is cost item A is a developer, for example, yeah, which is a full-time FTE and their X salary per year, but that developer is working on an HR application, but they're also working on a finance application and they're working on a marketing application. If IT is not giving that employee the ability to track their time against those three applications that that developer is working on, how in the heck can the organization look at the marketing application and say, we're not going to host that anymore internally, now we're going to outsource that to the SaaS application? They don't know what the true cost is if they don't understand that that developer is spending actually 80% of their time on the finance app and only 10% of their time on the marketing app.
Oh yeah, that is absolutely right, and I think you just hit like the single biggest difficulty in how to manage HR within IT is how to track and assign the time that people work to the products and services that they are actually working on. The easy answer is always to do, well, they need to fill timesheets, but we know how difficult that is in reality, especially for someone working on operational stuff. It's fairly straightforward if you're working on projects, as you were mentioning, working this much time on one project or another. But if I'm the operational staff working in a server room to keep the servers humming, I don't know what resides on each server, so I can't split my time between end client services. So we need to come up with ways of tracking their time in a way that at least gives us an idea of how we can split then between the different services.
Yeah.
The other thing, sorry, go ahead, Pierre.
No, you go ahead. You had a thought.
The other thing, just to finish the time tracking thought, is it's a discipline, it's a philosophy within the organization, and if it's not implemented well, if it's implemented in a way that makes it sound as though you want to spy on what your people are doing, the information you'll get out of it will be really bad. I mean, I've seen organizations where people fill their timesheets on the last day of the month and just basically put in hours wherever they feel like it, and obviously the end result of that is you have information you can't work with.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Pierre. Sorry.
Yeah, determining those costs for HR really come down to what information you have to work with, and you made a good point that if you're relying, in a perfect world, people would be able to report their time, or the resources would be able to report their time to specific service or service delivery. We know that such a perfect world can't exist and should never exist at that level because you need the flexibility within IT. What does come from this, though, is to have the information from various systems. That would be one system that you could use the information to determine cost, but there are other factors, and how many services are you providing, how many resources you have of that type, and creating, you could create really complicated algorithms and models to determine a resource's cost. What we've seen, though, is to keep that model to be as simple as possible, and maybe to rely on maybe 2 or 3 different points of view in terms of a simple model so that you can then evaluate. So it's not exact science, but it is something that you need to be aware of. That sub-bullet to HR being very much like IT finance is very similar. We haven't really talked about the similarities in that. Corporate finance is looking at corporate financial activities and assets from a capitalization point of view, and the big picture. And then the IT finance is more interested in the granular aspects of finance. Well, the same happens here in HR. HR is looking at corporate HR versus HR for IT, if you want, and understanding who is capable of capturing that granularity so that IT can function better and better understand the delivery of the service.
Definitely.
So, all of that to say, this is an area where leadership, within an organization needs to spend some time on what's your HR strategy for IT, right? And at least be thinking about that. How would you structure things? How can you improve on how you're capturing time and activity reporting? And and that would progress over time, and there's lots of dependencies, but this should be something, because as Richard said, the cost of IT is 50% HR, there should be a strategy or an improving strategy on how you capture time and activities. Okay.
So on that same note, and we touched a little bit on it earlier in terms of outsourcing, and because it is 50%, maybe the first knee-jerk reaction is, okay, how can we reduce our HR needs for delivering IT, and outsourcing is one approach. Keep in mind that you're always going to need people to deliver IT service. Whether you're outsourcing the service itself, you still need a resource, at the highest level to manage that outsourced service. So depending if it's a fully outsourced service, or if it's just components of a service, the human resource needed or the level and role needed changes, but the need will always be there, and to be aware of what that need is.
Yeah, and you bring another point, and I think it leads to something that Sue said earlier. I mean, if I am to look at outsourcing as a way of maybe not having to manage HR, because I mean that's certainly one of the reasons some organizations look at outsourcing. I need to understand what my current HR costs are, because I can't evaluate value of outsourcing if I don't understand what I'm actually paying now. And it's more than just adding salaries together and saying, this is my total salary. It's, understanding what people are doing, what they're working on, what stays, what goes, mm-hmm. and that's essential to even being able to consider outsourcing, I believe.
Right. And just to add to that, you touched on what stays and what goes, and I would even take that one step further: is what stays, what goes, and what would be the effort to bring it back if that delivery of service
right.
Doesn't work out as you had planned. So that's really something that needs to be looked at, and because human resources and a level of resource is built up over time, and it's not something you can quickly turn off and then turn back on within an organization.
Right.
No, definitely.
Great discussion. Okay, so let's cover our takeaways. The first one, due diligence. This is a big one. You definitely organizations need to take the time to ensure you have the right people in the right roles, and that's part of what we've talked about, making sure you understand what they're doing and what is that stuff that they're doing connected to, and what value do you place on the things that their activities are connected to. Really understanding what's going on from an HR perspective.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Sorry, and to that point, I mean, it's traditional IT, when we weren't thinking service, we have to kind of change the mindset. If we are to be service-oriented IT, the right people in the right roles may be different than what we thought of in the past. The simplest example is the service desk. I mean, in the past, that was like an entry position for the guy with no experience, put him at the service desk. Well, if you're a service-oriented organization, you don't want the junior person that can't answer any questions sitting at the service desk and being the front line to your clients. You want someone there with experience that's able to manage clients and so forth. So it's really important to start thinking about those roles from a service perspective, not just from a managing IT perspective.
Right.
Yeah, it's a service, and just to add, it's a service lifecycle role.
Yep.
It's traditionally IT has been more operational type resources, and there's got to be a really good balance between IT operational roles and IT strategic roles in terms of making sure that this continues. Operational is about keeping the lights on and reacting, and those strategic roles are more about planning on how to move this forward. And that's always been the biggest challenge in all the projects we've been involved with, has been change and change of mindset and change of what needs to get done. So it's not just operational.
Yep.
Okay, the second one we talked about quite extensively was, again, mapping and measuring HR's contribution as granularly as you can. And again, this is something that you will not be able to achieve in the first year, some kind of, very complex accountability and traceability mapping and measuring. Really, you need to look at what you can achieve today and then improve on that over time, and improve your processes, improve other areas within the operation that will allow you to be more granular in tracking your HR activities and costs. And that ties into the third point, which is, you can't expect corporate HR to manage the granularity that IT requires. That's not the way it will work. IT needs to come up with their own strategy in terms of how they're mapping and measuring HR activity, and then some of that will get boiled up to corporate HR. And just before we started this session today, we were talking as a group about, Richard, we were talking about contractors versus FTEs and the complexities of details within HR. I don't know if you want to share some thoughts on that a little bit.
Well, actually, for exactly that point on contractors versus employees, usually traditional HR systems don't focus on contractors. They often don't even show up in the corporate HR system. But from an IT perspective, they are HR within IT, and we need to manage them as such. We need to be able to track their time, what they're doing, their costs, just as closely as we would do our employees. So that's an example where the granularity that IT requires is completely different from corporate HR, because from a corporate perspective, a contractor is an invoice you pay at the end of the month. That's pretty much where it stops. There's a contract and there's an invoice. But from an IT HR perspective, we need to know just as much details from them as we need from any other staff in the organization.
It just reminded me of, before I forget, Pierre, they talk about shadow IT. When Richard was describing that, I was thinking of shadow HR, those contractors, and not,
Yeah.
And then if you go back to the outsourcing, how do I really calculate what my cost of a particular capability or service is? How are we incorporating shadow HR into that? Do we really know what percentage of my cost is shadow HR? Is that something I have not even factored in?
Yeah.
It's shining a bit of light there on that shadow to understand more about that resource and what they're involved in, and and then I would wager that consultants or non-employees are typically brought in to address specific projects. So that's one area to make sure that you are tracking what that resource is working on, what project, and then maybe blow it out from that point on. But definitely it's to provide that clarity in terms of how the resources are being used within the IT department.
Yeah. And just to your point, and I know we probably running out of time soon, but what happens though often is a contractor is brought in for a specific project, but then they start growing roots within the organization, and they stick around and take on operational roles, and they become a quasi-employee for all intents and purposes, but they are still considered a consultant or a contractor, and they've evolved from working on a project to working on everything within the organization, but they're probably maybe even charged to the project still. So a lot of things to understand there, that shadow HR perspective.
Yeah. So we are running out of time. We've got just over a minute left. I think the fourth bullet is pretty straightforward. Make sure that you're capturing onboarding and exit of your people, so that you can understand the impact that's going to have on your IT processes. So that's a big one. And then any change again that enables better mapping of HR costs, it's huge. It could be a very, very big deal to helping the business understand where budget is going, and is there value within that. And as we always talk about, continuous improvement. So how do you operationalize continuous improvement of your HR measures in IT? It should be a systematic part of your review and assessment and planning cycle within IT every year, so you can target ways to improve HR measures within IT. Any last thoughts before we close?
No, I think we've hit a lot of good points. We could have talked for hours on this after all.
Yes.
Yeah, we really never really touched the more the information side of things that HR can provide in terms of better managing. We touched that it's important to have access to that information, but just the onboarding and exit process within HR do affect IT, in that IT needs to know if that person's still there, or what their role is to better manage the IT infrastructure and IT resources. So yeah, definitely there's lots more to talk about.
So just FYI, we do have our next session completely separate from service-oriented IT. We're actually participating in a Bright Talk digital summit on enterprise software and infrastructure. And our perspective and our session will be focusing on the big picture, the big IT picture, and the role of enterprise software and infrastructure in that big picture. So if you visit our website and our upcoming events, you'll find a link to register for this particular summit webinar session, so we encourage you to do that. We'll be posting in the next coming weeks our next e-learning sessions, but if you have any topics you'd like us to cover, any questions about webinars and e-learning sessions we've delivered today, please send a note to info@rapaconsulting.com. And as always, we encourage you to take a look at our Rapa Insight technology and how it might help you see the big IT picture. So Pierre and Richard, thanks very much, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye-bye.